You're listening to Jason Lee Willis read The Wintermaker. This is part 4. Chapter 13, The Lion's Den, Haggard Quarry, June 20th, 1961. Biff Forsberg leaned against the aluminum siding of Haggard Quarry office. His shift had ended an hour ago, and he'd refused Wally Crane's ride home. I need to know if Paul is right about them. Unfortunately, his brother Paul was on the other side of the world. Shortly before 3 p.m., Ewan Haggard drove up, parked, and before Biff could even get to his feet, stomped into the office. Is my uncle a villain? Biff rose, but only to turn around to kneel. At the base of the aluminum siding, he pulled at the seam and reached in his hand for the pistol. At first, he wrapped his finger around the grip, coveting the power of an instrument of death. He turned the pistol to cradle it sideways in his hands. Has this gun been used to murder people? Biff felt as if he'd seen Uncle Ewan and all the others without their masks on, something Paul had tried to explain to him. 2 years ago, Paul Forsberg returned after his first tour in South Korea with news that he was re-enlisting for another 4 years. 4 years in the Army had turned Paul into a chiseled superhero, but during a morning of fishing down at the Crow Wing, Paul tried to warn him about their mother's relatives. What else did Paul know about them? Biff's leather boots kicked gravel as he walked around to the deck stairs. When he opened the front door, the secretary only glanced at him before returning to her phone call. Biff walked past her desk into the last office. Uncle Ewan sat at his desk in a state of disarray. When he saw Biff, he gave an upward nod as he continued a conversation about P-Rock for a construction site on the phone. Biff waited several steps from the front of the desk, now ignored by Uncle Ewan, but when Biff shifted his hands from cradling the pistol to holding it by the handle, Uncle Ewan cleared his throat and said, "Something's come up. I'll call you right back." Uncle Ewan's eyes didn't leave Biff as he struggled to find the phone cradle. "Something on your mind, Brian?" Biff nodded and took a few quick steps to set the pistol on the edge of the desk, yet he kept his fingertips on it. "I suppose I owe you an explanation, don't I? Have a seat and we'll talk." Uncle Ewan doesn't seem like a villain. Biff took his fingers off the pistol and sat. The men in the Thunderbird felt like the real villains. "I forgot about the pistol, didn't I?" his uncle sighed. "I just left it there for any Tom, Dick, or Harry to find. Honestly, I assumed Red had dealt with it. You been holding on to it all this time?" Biff nodded. He'd put it behind the aluminum skirting that day in case anyone accused him of theft. He didn't steal it. He just put it in a place where it wouldn't get wet. "You can keep it if you'd like." Pa wouldn't let me. "I suppose he wouldn't, but I can see that you want it. I'll keep it for you if you want, till you're older." Biff nodded, and Uncle Ewan grinned, reaching forward to slide it across the desk, and then dropped it into a desk drawer. "You're a lot different than your brother. That boy would have raised a fuss the second he saw a gun. He's overseas now. Ah, yes, I know all about that big brother of yours. For the longest time, your ma thought you were slow-witted, but it turns out you're just watching and keeping your yap shut. Did you tell anyone about our little incident?" The incident about the Thunderbird had been shared, but no one else knew about the early morning standoff. Biff shook his head. "You like working here at the quarry?" Uncle Ewan asked with a different tone. He's testing me. "I'd like to run the machinery one day." "I'm sure. You'll be strong as an ox in the fall for football. I don't have any kids, so I'm not really comfortable being around them. I hope you understand, but you're trying really hard not to be a kid anymore. Bringing me a loaded pistol? I suppose you want me to see you as an adult, huh? Who were the guys with Mr. Marquette and Mr. Stewart? Biff flinched. Why did I say that? Why did I cross that line? Uncle Ewan's brow tightened. Haggards come from the central highlands of Scotland, and our name roughly translates to son of the priest. I'll let you stew on that paradox for a moment. Mom thinks I'm slow-witted. Is he making fun of me too? Haggards, Uncle Ewan continued, for better or worse, were peasants. We were farmer folks, just like your pa. No shame in rolling up your sleeves to shovel some shit or shovel some rock, right? Your ma and I, however, also have royal blood in us. You have the same royal blood. We're descended from the Sinclair clan, who in one way or another have been rulers for countless centuries. Now I ask you, young Forsberg, can you explain the paradox of your mother's maiden name? Biff pondered the royal blood comment for a moment, and then tucked away the name Sinclair for later contemplation. Uncle Ewan had a smug expression on his face, so Biff solved the paradox. Priests are celibate. They don't have wives, so they shouldn't have sons. Uncle Ewan's crooked smile appeared for a moment. I was much older than you were when I learned about my ancestry, and this paradox led me to believe all Haggards were bastards, born out of wedlock. It turns out both my Haggard and Sinclair ancestors worshipped the old gods long before Christianity came to the shores of Alba. Haggards were not Catholic priests, it seems, and even though we went to the Christian church for weddings, funerals, and such, our religion existed thousands of years before Christ. Uncle Ewan crossed his arms before asking, do you know what Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday have in common? They all end with day, Biff mused before delivering the point Uncle Ewan wanted. They're all based on Norse gods. Mani, Tyr, Odin, Thor, Freya. Huh. When I saw you there holding that pistol, I didn't see your father or your mother. I saw the Sinclair blood in you. So, you secretly worship Norse gods? Uncle Ewan laughed loud. Not exactly, Biff, but it's a lot closer to the truth than you'd imagine. Our Sinclair blood is old, and if you were my son, I'd have told you all the old legends and lore by now. In fact, you'd be shipped off to a summer camp to really train you. The old Highland Haggards would explain it a hell of a lot better than I'm doing now. Wow. Paul was only scratching the surface. I'll have to tell him all about this the next time he comes home. So, what does any of this have to do with those guys in the Red Thunderbird? Biff pressed. Uncle Ewan hummed. Our family legacy is important, Biff. There is a burden to being an official member of the Sinclair family. Here in Hiawatha County, the name is represented by Stewarts, Marquettes, and myself, but our family tree is much larger than those here on the shore of Lake Manitou. Triton Corporation? Biff said, and when Uncle Ewan seemed a bit alarmed, he added, I've read about them in the newspaper. They own a bunch of businesses in Minnesota, including the quarry. I thought this baby boom generation was supposed to be a bunch of entitled, lazy halfwits. You certainly pay attention, don't you? Biff shrugged. I won't bother bullshitting you. I might not tell you everything, but I won't bullshit you. Triton is currently made up of 3 ruling families, the Delhuts, the Sinclairs, and the Tarrants. We all share the same Sinclair ancestry. However, the Tarrants are French, the The Delhuts are American, and the Sinclairs are Scottish. On paper, Triton Corporation owns steel mills, rubber plantations, and entertainment companies, but privately, Uncle Ewan rolled his eyes. There is a bit of a power struggle happening at the highest levels of the company. Here in America, our most recent leader, Pierre Delhut, died, and his son inherited a billion-dollar steel company. The head of the Sinclair family, Alistair Sinclair, is a paranoid old man who doesn't trust the young Ross Delhut. You following so far? Biff nodded. In May, the Morrison family moved to Split Rock from Colorado, and nobody in 6th grade talked to the new kid. Nobody trusts the new kid. That's right. Our loyalty is to the Delhut family, and it's been that way for centuries. Now that Pierre Delhut is gone, old Alistair Sinclair is trying to steal power away. He doesn't trust the new American boss, so he sends his guys to poke their noses into our business. My partners, Stewart and Marquette, foolishly allowed strangers to visit. If it was a test of our defenses, we failed miserably. If it was for nefarious purposes, we failed miserably. I guess that explains the shotguns. Uncle Ewan shrugged. You have more of a right with your quarter Sinclair blood than either of those men had stepping foot into my quarry. I swore an oath, and it's a blood oath. If I freaked you out by coming with guns, I hope you understand why I did it. I do. This is what Paul tried to warn me about. And I hope you understand why I need secrecy. Biff nodded. See, it's that royal blood of yours, Biff. Don't be thinking you're just the son of a lowly dairy farmer. You've got grit, and combined with your blood, you might make something of yourself. Do you have any more questions? Who is Chirani Basant? What's up with the Nazis? What kind of gods do you worship? What's in the tunnel? Why would anyone guard a rock quarry? Biff shook his head. Uncle Ewan stood up, and Biff stood also. Whenever you want that gun of yours, it's yours. I'm going to talk to Red also. After lunch break, I want you to be my wingman for the rest of the summer. I want to show you what it takes to run this quarry, and if you want, we can talk more about your birthright. Would you like that? Yeah, I was already a fan of Norse mythology ever since I read Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, huh? I'll share some stories Mr. Tolkien never heard at Oxford. Chapter 14, Where There's Smoke. Old Copper Road, June 20th, 1961. In her white work dress, Nicole Guerin carefully climbed past the protective metal rail and, after brushing away a spot, sat down on the wooden planks of the bridge, her feet dangling off the edge. She opened her father's lunchbox and unpacked the little meal beside her. The Crowwing River flowed 15 feet under her, and the birds went about their business as if nothing had happened. It had become her new routine following the fire. From Split Rock, a boy on a bicycle came flying down the hill. He pedaled with intensity, making him fly as fast as many cars that went by. Chris Looning gave her a little wave and then kept pedaling, most likely to Biff Forsberg's house on the other side of the river valley, or all the way to Carousel Park. Nicole longed to have a 12-year-old's free heart. A familiar maroon Chevrolet truck passed by Chris, descended the valley, and shook the bridge, and then slid to a stop as it began its ascent into town. It pulled off the road into the grass, leaning awkwardly into the ditch. Gavin McPherson emerged from the truck. He wore a pair of denim overalls without a shirt underneath and a red International Harvester hat. His thick leather boots kicked up rocks as he jogged to the bridge. "Hey, how've you been?" Been better. I looked for you at the creamery after dropping off my loads, but I haven't seen you. Yeah, I took a job in the bottling line to help make ends meet until my dad could go back to work. It's an 8 to 5 shift. I'm on my lunch break right now. How is your dad? It'll be a month before the burns on his arms heal, so he has to keep them wrapped with special gauze. He's in a lot of pain, but my mom is taking care of him. Until he can work again, I have to help put groceries on the table. It's a tough way to spend your summer, Gavin had said. I work almost every day, but at least I can get some free time when my chores are done. How's your grandmother? Nicole held back tears, thinking of her most recent visit to the hospital. Not good. Gavin climbed past the railing and sat down on the side opposite the lunchbox. Without invitation, he picked up Dr. Zhivago and began thumbing through it, which felt as personal as if he'd started unbuttoning her blouse. Flustered, she added, She's in the hospital at Brainerd. They have her on a ventilator because of all the damage the smoke did to her lungs. Because of a lack of oxygen, she hasn't really regained consciousness yet. I'm sorry, Gavin said softly, setting down her book. What are you sorry for? If it weren't for you, she would have been dead. Gavin merely looked at the river flowing below his feet. I'm serious. You're a hero. I saw you run around to the back of her house with an axe. You must have cut a hole right through the wall and pulled her out, didn't you? It seemed like the quickest way to get her out. It was only some lath and plaster, and fire was already burning in front of her window. Nicole moved her hand from her lap to touch the denim near his knee. I know you and your father don't want any credit, but you'll always be a hero to me. She withdrew her hand. How can I flirt while I'm talking about the fire? Would you like a slice of chocolate cake? I packed way too much food for dessert. Oh, no, I couldn't. Go ahead. I probably would have left it here for the birds anyway. Well, if you're not going to eat it, Gavin began and accepted the tinfoil wrapped slice of cake. Here, put the tinfoil back in the lunchbox, Nicole said as she watched him eat cake with the fingers. Gavin McPherson smelled like barn. His forearms were riddled with 100 red marks, likely from hauling hay bales, and he had a layer of dirt upon his face where rivulets of sweat made channels through it. It terrified Nicole how gorgeous he was to her. Watching him eat cake made it worse. He glanced over at her and smiled. Would you like a drink? She poured water from the thermos into the lid and offered it to him. She watched his lips wrap around the bottom of the cup where her own lips had recently been. He'd been on her mind almost as much as the sinister red thunderbird. What did your grandmother give me that night? It was Grandfather Gene's notebook. It was a journal he kept. A journal? It must have been pretty important. Once I broke through the wall and found her, she crawled back into the fire to get it. I had to pull her by her foot, or else she never would have come out. My grandfather was a missionary in the Philippines, Nicole said, thinking of the first few pages she'd read. He died a long time ago, so I guess she wanted to save some memories of him. Well, I hope she gets better soon, Gavin said, and then nervously bobbed his head. Say, if you're working each morning, I could give you a ride to work instead of bringing you home. That's nice, but now that my dad is unable to work, I'm actually using his car. I came here because it's better than sitting in a cafeteria with a bunch of old wives. Oh, sure. Her ears felt hot. Am I blushing? But I like having my lunch break with you. Are you usually free this time of day? Usually, yeah. My dad sends me to town to run some errands. Is this normally your lunch hour? Noon to 1 every day. But if it's raining, I eat in the cafeteria with everyone else. Well, I'll look for you then, Gavin said, rising. Save me a spot, would you? I'll do that. Nicole watched him walk back to the truck and then almost flip it over as he precariously as he drove precariously along the side of the steep ditch. She let out a deep sigh of relief once he was gone, weary of her own desires. She picked up her book to read about the illicit affair happening between poor Lara and the wealthy Komarovsky. Life imitating art? At the end of her shift, she quickly returned home and helped her mother prepare supper. Once supper was over and the dishes were done, Nicole ended up standing at the charred ruins of her grandmother's home. Little remained of the house that stood since her grandfather purchased it from Jeremy Bordeaux 6 decades earlier. The 100 dream catchers and their secrets had transformed into ash along with the walls, and the only metal that remained was the old wood iron stove, which stood naked amongst the rubble. Even days afterwards, she could still see smoke from some of the old beams and felt the heat as she walked. Her father had been born inside the ashen square she now stood beside, and he had almost died in there as well. The little wooden fence that encircled the house had been mostly knocked down along the front by the volunteer firefighters who responded to the call, but Nicole could see the back of the fence contrasted with the dark foliage of the woods leading toward Carousel Park. Somewhere on the other side of the woods, kids were screaming and enjoying their summers as they rode rides and gorged on sugary treats, but Nicole felt as if the theme park was a million miles away. A few feet from the big cottonwoods that towered over the other trees, a thin trail entered the woods. When her older sisters lived at home, all of them would walk the trail and sneak into the park rather than pay admission. The trail ended at the Venetian romantic rowboat ride, where couples could cross the bridge over Canaranzi Creek. Faux Italian singers serenaded those who waited in line. Couples took the floating path around the shallow waters behind Carousel Island, which was far more exotic in the day than at night. Nicole and her siblings would magically appear like fairies out of the woods and run across the bridge to the main part of the park. Now she realized the park attendants ignored them in patronizing sympathy for their poverty, which is why she rarely went there anymore. Gavin McPherson's words had troubled her for most of the day, and when she reached the backside of the charred house, she stood for a moment trying to remember where the window had once been. A few feet away, she saw Gavin's axe, where he must have tossed it aside once he'd made the hole. She knew she was falling for Gavin, not only because he was a hero, but also because he didn't treat her like a poor half-breed the way the rest of the town did. The fire showed Gavin's true character. Nothing grew beside Grandma Lily's house, since the house shaded the eastern sun and the big cottonwood shaded the western sun. Even at its tallest, the sun could filter only through some thin locust branches to cast light upon the back of the house. She and her grandmother had once transplanted ferns to the back, but they died by the end of the summer. A dirt swath almost 5 feet wide permanently existed behind her house. There was nothing to burn. Some of the back wall had fallen onto the dead patch, and it had also turned to brittle gray ash. Within the ash, she also saw an object. She used her toe to inspect it. At first, she didn't recognize the silvery object, so she crouched down and picked it up with her fingers. From the distinct 4-hole pattern to the steel hood to the round flint wheel still connected, Nicole held the lighter, realizing suddenly that the supposed accident might have been arson. Why would there be fire on a patch of dirt? Dirt doesn't burn. Yet on the night of the fire had encircled the house, trapping Lily. Gavin went around the corner where the flames were smaller under the window, which meant gasoline or kerosene had been used to turn the small house into an inferno before anyone could even smell smoke. Nicole looked back to the house. Confronted with this fact, her father would react irrationally and grow even more paranoid. The same fact would undoubtedly be ignored by her mother, who would never be able to understand ill will. Grandmother Lily had greeted the strangers in the red car with a knife in her hand, and then immediately went to TI for help. What does this mean? What should I do? Nicole turned her back on the burned house and took a few steps toward the forest. Even though the branches scratched and clawed at her, she pushed through, still clutching the head of the lighter. Once under the canopy of the woods, she could see the lake to her right and Old Copper Road up the hill to her left. After just a few extra steps into the woods, she found an empty 5-gallon gasoline can leaning against the trunk of an oak tree, confirming her worst fears. Chapter 15. Crushed Cans. Split Rock, Minnesota, June 23rd, 1961. Chris Looning blamed Biff for ruining the summer. After all, if he hadn't eaten the lunches, he wouldn't have gotten in trouble, which resulted in him working at the darned quarry. And because of him, his father had insisted Chris also get a job instead of screwing around the house and fishing away the summer. Chris took the last few bites of supper and stood up. His mother stopped her work in the kitchen, buttoned the top button of his shirt, and kissed him on the forehead. "Be a good listener tonight." A scout is obedient. "I will." His mother had wanted him to stay at home for another summer, but between Biff working at the quarry and Jimmy helping on the farm, she lost the argument to her father and husband. Outside the house, Grandpa Albert waited in the running car, but in the distance, Chris saw his father walking across the road from the lumber mill. "Good luck on your first day of work," his father called out from the edge of the road that separated the big warehouse from the house. "Do a good job." A scout is trustworthy. "I'm just picking up garbage, Dad. Any idiot can do that." His father had also lost his battle. If up to him, Chris would have been given a broom to sweep the sawmill, but his mother worried too much about the danger of the machines. Daddy's little girl went to her father, and soon Grandpa Albert came up with a new solution: working at Carousel Island. Chris knew this operation was better than being the boss's kid or a mama's boy. I miss being a kid already. "Ready to go, champ?" Grandpa Albert asked as soon as Chris opened the door. "Why is everybody making such a big deal about this?" "You're growing up, Christopher. A job means responsibility, and our world needs responsible people who can be trusted. You'll grow up, you'll show everybody what you're made of." Instead of playing at Carousel Park, Chris now had to work there each Friday and Saturday night. Even though the job would be potentially humiliating, it meant he'd earn his own money. A scout is thrifty. He'd already met his manager and went through the job description, but for his first shift or two, he'd work as an apprentice to the main custodian, an odd duck known as Can Man. As soon as Grandpa Albert parked, he got out of the car too. "What are you doing?" Chris asked. "I'm going to have a few drinks and listen to some music in the roof garden. Come and find me when your shift is over." The two had barely left the parking lot when a man came up to them and gave his grandpa a hug. "Good to see you, Cameron," Grandpa Albert greeted. "You too," Cameron Can Man Garin said, avoiding eye contact with Chris. "How's Chuck?" "Chuck's good," Grandpa Albert answered. "He's in Georgia learning how to be a helicopter pilot. Can you believe that?" Cameron nodded. "He used to like climbing trees. He's not afraid of heights." "I suppose that does make sense. How's your father doing?" Grandpa Albert asked. "He's home now." "That's good to hear. And your grandmother?" "She's still in the hospital in Brainerd." "You might not believe it, but your grandmother taught me my Sunday school classes when I was a boy. She'll be in my prayers. When you see her, tell her Albert Fisher sends her regards." Grandpa Albert turned to Chris. "Cameron, this is my other grandson. This is Christopher. He's going to be your apprentice." A scout is kind. Chris extended a hand. Pleased to meet you, Cameron. Any friend of Chuck is a friend of mine. Yeah, well, he's my brother, but sure, I understand. Is this why Grandpa Albert wanted me to work here? Because of Can Man? Grandpa Albert went his separate way, leaving Chris to his apprenticeship. Chris already knew Cameron Guerin, but only from a distance. Cameron Can Man Guerin was odd. Chris didn't want to be mean about it, but the 21-year-old had the mentality of an elementary student. His eyes were nervous, his gait hunched, and he shuffled like his shoes weighed 10 pounds more than regular shoes. His dark hair was combed over from one ear to the other, held in place by thick hair gel that left a coating of dandruff on his shoulders. Friday nights are the worst, Cameron said, handing Chris a pair of gloves. Oh yeah, Can Man? Why is that? Remember to be kind. Cameron didn't notice the nickname. On Saturday nights, folks don't drink as much because they don't want to attend church with a hangover. Fridays, they know they can just sleep it off. That was all Cameron had to say for almost an hour as they made a sweep of the park. By the time they finished, the sun had set, allowing park goers the luxury of just dropping the trash on the ground rather than finding a bin. And the teenagers that came on Fridays often drank and caroused. Chris helped empty a garbage can into the dumpster at the front corner of the parking lot and let the lid slam down loudly. He placed the garbage back into the cart built with plywood and repurposed bicycle wheels and tightened the strap around the belly of the can. Growing up sucks. I should be playing instead of working. Grandpa Albert remembered when Carousel Park opened and told Chris all about it. Carousel Amusement Park had opened in the 1920s as part of a chain of amusement parks developed by Charles Veidt. Many of the rides and attractions remained as they'd been built 4 decades earlier. The Nickel Games, Dog and Pony Show, the Crazy Mirrors were placed at the front of the park. Chris walked beside Cameron, who rolled his cart down the middle of the pathway, hunting for stray wrappers or empty bottles. Cameron paused in front of the Crazy Mirrors, smiling as they made his body long and twisted. He nudged Chris to do the same. Chris looked down, refusing. Cameron raised his arms, and they became octopus tentacles reaching out of the water. Chris saw a group of kids glance at them. A scout is loyal. Chris indulged him and moved his arms, bringing a big belly laugh from Cameron. Cameron's smile quickly left, and he continued pushing his cart. Mr. Shoemaker says we're not supposed to talk to any of the customers, especially the children. Just keep your head down when you work. Chris didn't care. His head was on a swivel as elementary kids tried for the prizes at the Midway. At night, the illuminated carousel was more magical than ever, and the garbage can near the gate both paused to watch the majestic horses leaping into the air, followed by cats, rabbits, and other equally beautiful creatures. I like the song it plays, Cameron said sadly. Chris waited patiently for them to continue. Next came the large buildings that housed the bumper cars and the roller skating rink. The line for the bumper cars was filled with middle school kids. Chris remembered Biff taunting Can Man with pelts of Bucky and "What's up, Doc?" because of his teeth. Now, Biff was too tired to play. Jimmy Nielsen also was worked like a man. The smirks of other fifth-grade boys were directed at Chris, shielding Can Man from overt teasing. This time. Cameron retreated, moving to the roller skating rink filled with mostly middle school girls who circled and twirled in packs. They waved at Chris before whispering and giggling to each other. Chris worked feverishly just to move on. Together, he and Cameron swept through the benches, changing area, and the dining tables surrounding the skate rental booth. Unlike the rest of the park, which seemed more fantastical in the night, The peony gardens became a maze of waist-high shadows, and the large flowering blossoms turned into shadowy faces. The paths led to the roof garden, where live bands performed for the adult crowd. Even though the roof garden had the most garbage, it was the most genial crowd. If it isn't the working man! Grandpa Albert stood with 2 drinks in his hand. Chris ignored all protocols and rushed forward, wrapping his arms around his grandfather. Hey, Grandpa. Cameron looked down nervously. We're not supposed to talk to customers, Chris said with a grin at his grandfather. And I'll let you get back to work, Grandpa Albert whispered with a nod to Cameron. Cameron pulled back and kept moving through the tables facing the dance hall, pulling Chris away. I'll be right here when your shift is over, Grandpa Albert called out. He'll probably have cotton candy waiting. After sweeping through the 2-story building, Cameron and Chris returned to the cart, pushing it toward the beach, where the water rides were beginning to close for the night. The log chute had been one of the first rides of the park. It sent riders plummeting 60 feet into the waters of Lake Manitou. When darkness arrived, all the water rides were shut down for safety reasons, allowing them to sweep the beach and empty the cans a final time. Just behind the beach area, the grandest attraction of Carousel Island, the Python, stood towering above the oak trees. Built in 1947, the wooden roller coaster had been painted green and was visible from almost any shore of Lake Manitou, including from the distant St. John, the opposite shore of the lake, 7 miles away. Standing 80 feet tall at its highest peak, the 18-passenger roller coaster would shoot across the waters of Lake Manitou before looping around into the woods of Deadwood Island and returning to the mainland. The popular 3,000-foot track reached speeds of 50 miles an hour and took 2 minutes to complete. My father normally maintains the roller coaster, Cameron said. Instead of Louis Guerin, another man sat on a stool behind, chatting away with the young woman collecting tickets. Behind the Python, an illuminated path led to the arched cement bridge that spanned Canaranzi Creek. In front of the bridge, another path came from the parking lot so that folks could bypass the rides in order to head directly for the island. Once across the cement bridge, an elevated wooden path led over the swampy grass to the final exhibit, the Venetian Romantic Rowboat Ride. Here, teenagers would follow a path of floating lanterns around the shallow waters between the shore and Deadwood Island. Cameron quickly passed by all the young lovers and took the wooden bridge that floated upon the surface of the water. Chris paused to test the buoyancy of the floating bridge, hastening the crossing of his mentor. At the center of the island, the trees were cleared away for a second carousel, this one with only horses, and for the large stage where bands would provide music for the local teens from Wadena, Park Rapids, and even Brainerd. Tonight, the Sunshine Band played hits from Elvis, Johnny Cash, and Jerry Lee Lewis, as 100 teens enjoyed the music. My sister is somewhere in that mess, Cameron grinned. Do you know Nicole Guerin? Do I? Chris had fallen in love with her back in 3rd grade, and whenever he saw her, his heart fluttered. Is it good or bad that I'm working beside her brother? She used to be my babysitter. Cameron stayed on the outside of the large dance hall, where picnic tables gathered the exhausted or reticent. The noise of the band, the crowd, and the passing roller coaster made Cameron proceed with total focus, while Chris lost all of his. The cart was full of garbage, and after the sweep around the back of the concert stage, they returned to the front of the park. As they reached the other side of the stage, the drums exploded, and screams filled the air. Cameron started to look around, but paused when his eyes landed on Cameron. Man, what? Something's wrong, Cameron interrupted. The cacophony Chris had heard had been too loud for the circular drum set. A pulsing gasp and crackle of instruments flowed through the crowd, and then a different kind of terror. The crowd of teenagers divided. Some ran toward the bridge, and others ran from the stage and into the woods. Others stood or dropped to the ground on the dance floor. But all of them looked toward the trees opposite the stage. Chris suddenly realized what sound was absent: the familiar noise of the roller coaster. "Let's go, Cameron." Once they reached the roller coaster, dozens of onlookers stood looking up in the trees, where bodies hung from the branches. Some writhed and screamed, while others simply hung limply like raggedy dolls. "We need bandages. We need some cloth to help with the bleeding." A scout is brave. Heroes bolted past them toward the floating bridge, but Chris could only take a single step closer. Boys were climbing trees like monkeys to reach the figures caught in the branches. Flashlights and lanterns quickly brought the details of the scene into the light. At the curve of the track, where the python banked and turned back towards the lake, the railing had been sheared away, and one of the steel tracks stuck out like a finger, pointing toward the swath of destruction through the trees. Blood rained down on a boy climbing one of the trees. In another tree, 3 boys lifted a body from the crook, the limp arms doing nothing to help the descent. "Nicole!" Cameron shouted, and then, like a lost calf, continued to bellow her name. Almost unable to breathe, Chris wrapped his arms around his chest. A third tree held a frantic young woman whose long hair had somehow been caught in the branches of a tree, causing her to spin and dangle as 2 boys tried to lift her legs while another tried to free her hair. Chris grimaced as her plaid dress lifted to reveal her panties and long socks. It wasn't Nicole, though. He couldn't swallow and almost gagged at the bile surging up from his belly. Looking away from her awkward rescue, Chris spotted the overturned roller coaster cars. One car contained 4 passengers, still buckled in, sitting wide-eyed upon the flat ground. The passengers in the other 2 cars were not so fortunate. One had rolled and twirled, leaving it looking like a crushed tin can. A group of shirtless boys stood around a bloody corpse where they had used their shirts to mop up the blood from an unseen wound. A few feet below that, another group wept over a dead body. Beyond that, Chris could see a group of young men gathered around an overturned car, whose smooth silver wheels rotated freely, unbound by their normal track. When the boys finally flipped the car, a collective gasp and groan came from the crowd, for under the car were 2 severed bodies, cut in half when the car hit the ground, and slid to a stop. From the blood and gore, a third body moved, and despite the carnage, hands pulled a young girl, a sole survivor, from the back seat. Cameron had vanished, leaving Chris alone and frightened. Adults came running to the scene, trying to bring order to the chaos. The wounded were treated right there on the cold ground of Deadwood Island, and the remains were quickly covered with shirts and jackets. Hundreds stood around the scene of the accident, watching helplessly as bodies were gathered under lantern light. Chris felt his knees weaken, and soon he joined the others who openly wept. Behind the whisper of prayers, Chris thought he heard singing and chanting coming from the darkness of the trees, and when he looked toward the sound, the shadows grew darker and began to move. Am I seeing things? Am I about to faint? What is that? The wail of sirens soon replaced the sound of chanting. But even when the flashing lights arrived, the ordeal was not over, for none of the vehicles could cross the footbridge to the island. Men with stretchers came pushing through the crowd, carrying off the worst of the wounded. Chris crouched as the world revolved around him. The hazy details spread through the crowd quickly. 4 passengers had been killed. Gladys Kruger of Walker, Minnesota, died when her body came free and hit a tree. The parents of Leona and Mary Brady of Sisseton, South Dakota, arrived on the island along with a swell of other adults from the park, only to realize their girls had been the 2 killed when the front car flipped over. Walter Zebus of St. Cloud had been in the seat behind them, died from a broken neck, yet his sister Ruth had miraculously survived. In the crowd, one of the onlookers threw arms around Cameron. It was Nicole. Chris took a few steps closer. Nicole didn't say anything, but simply clutched tightly to her brother as she wept. Finally, she said, "They're going to blame Dad for this. And he wasn't even here. Let's go, Cameron. Let's go." "Wait, take me with you." A moment later, Grandpa Albert emerged from the crowd, gathering Chris up in an embrace that was too futile to shield him from the trauma he'd already seen. A scout is supposed to be prepared. I wasn't prepared. Chapter 16. Fuel for the Fire. Old Copper Road, June 24th, 1961. Deadwood Island grew silent as the sun began to rise above the horizon. Wally Crane stood along the western shore. The toes of his boots pointed toward the main body of the lake. As anticipated, looky-loos were already jumping in their boats to see for themselves what had happened the previous night. A Hiawatha County Sheriff's deputy anchored his boat 100 yards offshore, which kept the other boats at a distance for the time being. Wally wore his Lake Manitou Fire Department jacket and yellow helmet to further convince onlookers that the scene of the accident had been tightly locked down. Now that the sun had come up, he could view the arched back of the roller coaster and the two tracks reaching out from the mainland. A few yards behind him, the silvery polish of the unerected track suddenly stopped at the place where the track had broken and sent the riders smashing into the trees. Over at the park, a dozen emergency vehicles still flashed their red lights, but on the island, all the bodies had been taken away and the crowds dispersed, leaving Wally alone with the congealed blood and trees. He heard footsteps and turned toward the heart of the island. Ed Nielsen, also wearing LMFD gear, walked toward him carrying 2 cups of coffee. 10 years his senior, Ed was small but tough as nails. The long night seemed to have little effect on the leathery farmer. "The state BCA investigators have arrived to replace us. This coffee is a friendly fare thee well." Wally took up the offered cup. "BCA? Are they going to be treating this as a criminal investigation?" "Don't get ahead of yourself. The BCA is here to do a forensic analysis of what happened," Ed said after taking a sip of his coffee. "My bet is that governmental agencies were fighting it out in St. Paul, and somebody gave it to the BCA to keep it on neutral turf. This is going to get pretty ugly." Wally could see teams of investigators being led from the parking lot to the little concrete bridge that spanned Canaransi Creek. "Follow me," he said, turning away from the beach and into the woods. "I've got something I want to show you." I was dreading this conversation. "It's not what you think." Wally looked at the trees to get his bearings until he found the big oak tree. Walking to the northern side, he found a bare patch where the bark had been cut away to the lighter pulp beneath. He pointed to the message that had been carved there with an old Barlow knife. "Earl loves Nancy." "Earl loves Nancy," Ed repeated. "I take it you carved this?" "That's your given name, isn't it, Earl?" Wally nodded. "Nancy's the only one who still calls me Earl. It's been almost 2 decades now. I came here a lot after I got back from the Pacific. It's where I first met Nancy, and on one of our first dates, we snuck away from the concert, kissed under this tree, and I carved a declaration of my love." Wally smacked the tree as if it were a trusted steed. "I tried to find a little silver lining after the nightmare I saw last night." Never sentimental, Ed cut to the chase. "So?" "I don't know what to think. Something's happening, and we're just standing here holding our dicks in our hand. First, they stole our queen, and now this? The Asante Lodge is a mess. Even if we were at full strength, who are we fighting, Wally? Just point me in the right direction." "I need you to hold steady, Ed. My dad claimed that he once stabbed the Manitou in the belly and that it bled all over his hands. My Uncle Monty confirmed most of the story, except for the part about seeing the Manitou. If we get emotional and carried away, we might just make matters worse. Father Guerin said our enemies will wear false faces, will only remove the mask at the last moment. Let's see what the state investigators say first. Maybe we're just looking at 2 accidents." "Bullshit," Ed bristled. "A bunch of kids are dead, and the Guerin family was hit hard. The Asante Lodge needs to convene. All of us. Paul Forsberg is stationed in Vietnam. How am I supposed to get him to show up?" "That's why we should have chosen Glenn instead of your wonderkin Eagle Scout. What good is he to us if he's not here when we need him?" "You know why we couldn't pick Glenn to replace his father." "Careful, Wally. He's my brother-in-law." "Yes, and Bonnie comes from good Forsberg stock. Glenn chose to marry that haggard woman, and he was already married before his father passed. We couldn't risk it. Now, I'm sure Paul will find out what happened without me needing to raise alarms. My biggest concern is Albert. Albert Fisher might be old, but you heard Marlon Looning's cough? That damn lumber mill is killing him. How can we rely on either of them when the going gets tough? With Paul in Germany, we're just a bunch of old men." Father Guerin wrote that the battle would be both physical and spiritual. "And with Lily gone, where does that leave us? Norval Riel? What do we even know about that man?" "First of all, Lily's not gone. Get that through your head, Ed. Norval knows more about this stuff than any of us." "But we didn't pick him, Wally. He was just sent to us after Paul Whitewolf died. There's a reason Gene Guerin left the Jesuits." "Norval Riel wasn't sent by the Jesuits," Wally retorted. "What do you want from me, Ed, huh?" Wally asked, raising his voice so loudly that he looked around to see if he'd been noticed. "Let's go. Maybe I can make sense of things once I get a little sleep." Wally began walking, not even checking to see if Ed followed. By the time he reached the clearing at the dance hall, he saw the rest of the Lake Manitou Fire Department volunteers clustered together sipping coffee. Deputy Charlie Roy led the BCA inspectors into the clearing, where they began to set down their gear. Fire Chief Ken Uzelman stood a few paces from the rest of his crew. He nodded when he saw Wally and Ed. Glenn Forsberg stood with Dale Sunby, Otto Waln, Warren Lawrence, and Dean Holmberg. Uzelman declared, "Well, I should probably get you fellows home to your wives. Until the investigation is done, keep your trap shut. Rumors really make matters worse, and people in the community will take whatever you say as gospel." Chief Uzelman led the Lake Manitou Fire Department back the way they'd come hours earlier, and when they reached the walking bridge, their boots echoed across the waters. Ed left for his own truck, but Wally, having come from St. John, joined the others on the ladder truck. After returning the ladder truck and medical truck to the station, Wally looked at his watch to realize it was only 7 o'clock. He sat in his green GMC for a few moments before staring up and heading north instead of south. He took Highway 34 west, and when he reached Nimrod Road, he let his foot off the gas before he decided against heading to the res for answers he didn't want to hear yet. Instead, he stayed in routine. Ullman Oil Co-op was located on the western side of St. John on the Sabika Road. Wally had been supplying gas, oil, propane, and fuel oil to farms, houses, and businesses around Lake Manitou for more than a decade through worse weather than a postman could possibly imagine. During the winter, lives were often on the line, and because of this, Wally delivered regardless of what life threw at him. "I've been listening to the radio about the accident at Carousel Park," Gene Ullman said as soon as Wally stepped through the doors of the office. "How bad was it?" Wally grabbed a clipboard from the wall hangers and checked the delivery slips. "Pretty bad, Gene. Pretty bad. I always thought it was a bad idea to put that roller coaster over water. Those footings are bound to move in the mud every time the ice comes off the lake." "It wasn't the footings, Gene," Wally said, flipping through orders. "It was sabotage." "Is this slip wrong? I just stopped at Haggard Quarry on Wednesday." "It's correct. They've been burning the midnight oil, so to speak. Apparently, business is booming, and they're striking while the iron's hot." After stopping by a road crew that was resurfacing a stretch of county road, Wally drove to Haggard Quarry, where he had to wait as a fully loaded truck came roaring up out of the quarry. Driving into the quarry always bothered him, but it was better than letting the younger drivers do it, so The job usually fell to him. If he kept his eyes on the road, the passage was easy. But Wally's peripheral vision often got the better of him, and he'd ride the brake until he reached the bottom of the road. He drove to the tin shed at the deepest, farthest part of the quarry. Red Dobie stepped out to greet him. No matter the season, Red wore a Detroit Red Wing stocking cap over his spaghetti-colored hair. Red had also been born and raised in Hiawatha County. Although Red was a bachelor, his family tree connected back to the Sinclairs through a line in Albany, New York. For all intents and purposes, though, Red Dobie was Haggard Quarry. Red waited at the big fuel tanks while Wally prepared the discharge hose. Heard all about the disaster at Carousel Island. How many folks died? Too many for one night. Agreed. Did I hear correctly that the roller coaster came off its tracks? It helped only with securing the scene of the accident. I helped only with securing the scene of the accident. I didn't get to do so much as an investigator does, Wally admitted. He handed the job clipboard to Red, who signed the slip, took his copy, and handed it back. I suppose you've been up since yesterday morning? I'll be sound asleep by this afternoon, that's for sure. Wish I could catch a break. They've been working me to the bone the last few weeks. Yeah, I noticed the oil orders have doubled. You guys supplying every road between here and St. Paul? It's not the pink quartz, Red shrugged as he worked on the valve of his storage tank. We've reached the bottom of the seam, but apparently there's some special type of granite below the quartz. You ever curl before? Of course. You might not know it, but each curling stone is mined on an island off the coast of Scotland, Ailsa Craig. Haggard has a team of quarrymen come all the way from Scotland to work this seam of granite. Is he looking into getting in the curling stone business? Who knows? Apparently it's some rare stone, so he's trying to capitalize on it, which means I'm working overtime this summer. I see. Wally felt his body burning on fumes. Well, hang in there, Red. We can both sleep when we're dead. After leaving Haggard Quarry, Wally returned to Almond Oil, turned in his clipboard, and arrived home by mid-morning. His 3 daughters were playing on the swing set when he pulled into the old farmstead. All 3 ran up to his truck to greet him with hugs. Is your mother inside? Wally asked. She's writing. She told us to play outside. Can we go inside now? I suppose that would be fine. The girls dashed ahead of him, throwing the screen door open so loudly so that it slammed loudly as it closed. His wife reached the door before he could open it. How are you doing? A lot of shook-up folks, Wally said. Pretty messy scene. Anyone we know? I don't think so. Mostly folks that drove in for the weekend. Come on in. I brewed up a fresh pot of coffee. I've already made my oil run, so I'll pass on the coffee for now. I think I might need something a little stiffer than coffee to get me through the day. I promised the girls that I'd bring them into Brainerd to do some shopping. Do you want to come with us? You know, keep your mind off things. No, I think I could use a little time for myself, Wally said, stripping off the denim shirt he'd worn for 2 days. At the dining room table, he saw Nancy's typewriter and a stack of completed pages. I'd appreciate the solitude. We'll talk about it more when you get home. This is the end of Part 4.